Whenever a newer investor comes to me and asks me what I personally think or recommend that they would invest into, and especially if this is somewhat of a newer investor that really doesn't even necessarily know the start of investing in the stock markets, I often tell them to look into something like VTI or the Vanguard Total Stock Market ETF, and that's because this ETF is not only tried and true, but is diversified. I mean, it's so diversified because it's literally the entire stock markets. Now in this video, we're going to dig deep into VTI, the Vanguard Total Stock Market ETF, go over what this ETF is, how it works, the holdings within this ETF, and of course the performance this ETF has seen long term. Then later on, we're going to figure out if VTI is in fact worth investing into and if it stands up to the hype, because this ETF is pretty popular. So if you're interested in investing into a high quality ETF and want to learn more about it, make sure to drop a like down below, subscribe, and let's get right into it. Real quick, for those that haven't already, make sure to go to the first link in my description and grab my new dividend investing ebook, where I share exactly how I went from $0 invested to now earning over $6,000 on a monthly basis and over $1 million invested in the market. Along with the ebook, you're also going to receive my custom dividend tracker, where you can track your dividend progress on an ongoing basis and reach your dividend investing goals. So make sure to grab yourself a copy of my dividend investing ebook and the new dividend tracker today. It's the first link in my description. So like we sort of talked about in the intro, VTI, the Vanguard Total Stock Market ETF. This is an ETF that is extremely diversified, has a ton of holdings in it, and basically gives you exposure to the entire stock market, which is a diversified investor's dream. Now, like I sort of mentioned, if a family member or friend comes to me and chooses to ask me for investing advice because of course they know that I'm very involved in the stock market, I personally often will tell them to look into VTI just because this ETF is a low cost, one-stop shop, fund to hold on to that gives you exposure to basically everything. And speaking of low cost, VTI has a very cheap expense ratio of 0.03%, so the fund is more or less almost free to hold on to, which is pretty awesome because with the click of the button, you are getting exposure to so many stocks across so many sectors, across basically everything. Now, the product summary for VTI says seek to track the performance of the CRSP US Total Market Index, large, mid, and small cap, equity diversified across growth and value styles, employs a passively managed index sampling strategy, remains fully invested, and low expense minimizes net tracking error. Now, VTI has been around since around 2001, so there's lots of data to go off of, which is fun to look into because, of course, although past performance does not equal future performance, it still gives us an idea of what we can expect. Now, later on, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into the performance of VTI and how much money investors would have made if they invested during different timeframes, etc. But basically, since inception in 2001, if an investor invested into VTI, they would have received around 8.58% annually, which is not bad whatsoever. Although, of course, these days, there's lots of ETFs that absolutely destroy that. Now, looking at VTI's performance over different time frames. On the 1 year time frame, this ETF is performing amazingly, 25.71% return over the last 365 days. Year to date, not bad whatsoever either, up around 10%. The last 5 years, up 85.12%. The last 10 years, up 157%. And on the max time frame in this chart, up 351%. So regardless, pretty much throughout history, this ETF's performance has remained very stable, although there was a pretty big drop back in 2022, but it's recovered since then and basically trading right next to all-time highs. Now, as far as the holding breakdowns, this is going to be fun to look into for this specific ETF because, like I said, once again, it's so diversified with so many different stocks. Like I said, all the stocks and then some. So the holding breakdowns is technology at 28.8%. Then we have financials at 12.97%, healthcare at 12%, consumer cyclical at 10%. Then we have industrials at 9.5%, communication at 8.4%, consumer defensive at 5.7%, energy at 4.2%, real estate, utilities, and basic material just over 2%. Now, this is honestly a pretty decent breakdown, especially like I said, if you want to invest into something that's going to be mildly stable but still have a little bit of beta. The diversification as far as sectors does not bother me whatsoever, which is why, once again, for an investor that wants to buy into a fund and not really have to worry about it, this is definitely an ETF, in my opinion, to look into. Now, to be more specific, this is the main reason on why this ETF has performed so nicely over the past 10 or so years. Microsoft is almost 6% of this entire ETF as of right now. 5% is Apple, and Nvidia is 4%. So between Nvidia, Apple, Microsoft, it makes up around 15% more or less of this entire ETF. So although this ETF is what I would consider extremely diversified, even over diversified, with over 3,700 holdings within this fund, you are getting a little bit of exposure from everything. Although it is exposed to so much, this ETF, if we want to be honest, between Amazon, Nvidia, Apple, Microsoft, this makes up a large portion of the overall fund, which I personally do not have any problem with. And honestly, even the top 10 holdings altogether, these are all holdings within my portfolio. I'm exposed to them through different ETFs, and long term, I would bet on every single one of these personally. But like I sort of mentioned, 3,721 holdings within this ETF, so you are going to expose to all the stocks in the market. Now, of course, this ETF is more or less a growth style ETF, but it does also pay a dividend with some decent dividend growth stats if we want to be honest. Now, where it's trading at currently, obviously the trailing 12-month dividend yield is going to be pretty low because it's basically trading at all-time highs, but VTI does have a 1.36% trailing 12-month dividend yield, so for every $100, you're going to earn around $1.50 per year in dividends. But what's pretty impressive is that there actually is some substantial dividend growth, which isn't going to be the biggest concern for most investors out there. But just for some reference, around 10 or so years ago, the dividends that were getting paid by VTI were around 39-40 cents or so. And as of right now, the dividends are double that. So on a cash flow basis, investors are getting paid more and more consistently, which I don't think anyone's complaining about. Now, we sort of talked about earlier that VTI is more or less returned around 8.5% to 9% annually on average year after year, which again is not bad whatsoever. But things like the S&P, things like the Qs, there are other ETFs out there that are a little bit more concentrated on some of the top names. So there are, of course, other ETFs across the market that have performed better than this, but still not bad whatsoever. But in the talks of how much an investor would have returned over the past, say, 23 years or so since this ETF's inception, if an investor invested around $10,000 into this ETF with reinvesting dividends along the way, this investor would turn that $10K into around $70,000, which again is not bad whatsoever, although across the market there are other ETFs that of course have done better. So all in all, is VTI the Vanguard Total Stock Market ETF worth investing into, even though it's averaged around 9 or so % return year after year, when there are other ETFs out there with some more concentrated exposure that's returned more? I personally think that the Vanguard Total Stock Market ETF is an amazing foundation to a long-term portfolio. And I think especially for newer investors that don't necessarily have the information or their strategy fully built out yet, but want to get their feet wet, want to start investing into the stock markets, but just don't really know how to do it yet, I think that consistently buying a share here, a share there of VTI could be an amazing strategy, especially for newer investors out there. Now, would I personally want to build a portfolio with only VTI in it, and or would I ever choose VTI as the only sole fund in my portfolio? Well, absolutely not, just because VTI, of course, does give you exposure to basically everything, which honestly, although I'm a huge fan of diversification, I even tend to think that that's a little bit over-diversified. But lastly, most importantly, now I want to hear from you guys down below. Do you personally have VTI in your portfolio as of right now? And if so, what are your thoughts on buying it for the future? Let us know down below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to please drop a like and subscribe for more future content like this. Be sure to grab yourself a copy of my dividend investing ebook and the new dividend tracker today. It's the first link in my description. Thanks as always for stopping by, and if you are interested in investing, make sure to check out these recent videos I posted right here.